This story is titled, My Parents Threw a Celebration Party for Completing Their Life's Work Project. But when I discovered I wasn't invited, I took back my expensive gift and disappeared. Later, she found out what was inside and begged for forgiveness. Hey Reddit, my name is Tyler, and I'm 29 years old. This is the story of how I attended my mom's retirement party, bought her an $800 gift, only to be seated in the hallway like a complete outsider. I didn't say a single word during the entire humiliating experience. Instead, I went home and sent them a formal letter demanding they pay back every loan they had ever taken from me. Here's exactly how everything went down. I learned at an early age exactly where I ranked in my family's pecking order, and it was dead last. My father is a 64-year-old man who spent 30 years working as a regional manager for a construction equipment company. He struts around town like he personally built every subdivision within a 50-mile radius, acting like some kind of local celebrity. My mother is 63 years old and worked as the head nurse at the most prestigious local hospital. She spent more time networking and playing politics than actually helping patients, but she wore her position like a crown. They were solidly middle-class people, but they acted like they were members of some secret society, just waiting for their invitation to join the elite in the Hamptons. The way they carried themselves, you'd think they had trust funds and summer homes instead of a mortgage they could barely afford and credit cards they maxed out regularly. The family hierarchy was painfully obvious from the time I was about 8 years old. My younger brother Blake, who's 25 now, was always the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong. He could literally take a dump on the dinner table, and my parents would somehow find a way to praise his creativity and boldness. My sister Maya, who's 27, existed in this diplomatic middle ground where she wasn't openly favored but was never considered the disappointment either. She learned early on to keep her head down and avoid making waves. Then there was me, Tyler, the family workhorse. I was the one they called when they needed something fixed, moved, installed, or paid for. I became a mechanic straight out of high school because I was good with my hands and actually enjoyed the work. Over the years, I worked my way up to shop manager at a high-end garage in the city that specializes in luxury and performance vehicles. I make good money there, enough to live comfortably while saving for the future. We're talking about a solid salary plus performance bonuses, which in our San Antonio area goes pretty far since the cost of living is reasonable. I've got a solid 401k plan, excellent health benefits, and 3 weeks of paid vacation every year. But in my parents' eyes, getting your hands dirty fixing German sports cars was barely a step above being unemployed. Apparently, real success only counts if you're wearing a tie to work every day and sitting behind a desk in some corner office, regardless of how much money you actually make or how stable your career is. Meanwhile, Blake had dropped out of community college after just 2 semesters because, according to him, the entire educational system was designed to crush creativity and independent thinking. He's been living at home, completely rent-free for the past 7 years, cycling through various part-time jobs and half-baked startup ideas that never seemed to materialize into anything substantial. The longest he ever managed to hold down a job was 8 months at a local coffee shop, and even that ended when he quit because the manager supposedly didn't respect his creative process and unique approach to customer service. His latest brilliant venture was some kind of subscription service for what he called curated wellness experiences. In reality, it was just overpriced tea samples that he bought in bulk from Alibaba and repackaged with fancy labels and pseudo-spiritual marketing copy. Pure genius, that one. He'd spend hours crafting social media posts about entrepreneurship and the grind, while never actually doing any real work or generating any meaningful income. Meanwhile, I had somehow become the family's go-to guy for literally everything. I was the person who fixed their cars for free whenever something went wrong, helped them move furniture around the house, installed all their new appliances, and had somehow transformed into their personal IT department without ever volunteering for the role. Every single time my dad got a virus on his computer from clicking on sketchy email links promising him millions from Nigerian princes, guess who spent their entire weekend cleaning up the digital mess? Every time my mom accidentally deleted important files or couldn't figure out how to use some basic software feature, guess who had to drop everything and rush over to recover her data and walk her through the process step by step? And yet, whenever I tried to mention any of my work achievements or talk about interesting projects I was working on, they would immediately change the subject or find some way to redirect the conversation back to Blake's latest entrepreneurial breakthrough or some social event they were planning to attend. It was like my professional life and accomplishments simply didn't exist in their world, except when they needed something from me. Maya could see right through their bullshit, but she had learned to play Switzerland in all family conflicts. She'd text me privately after particularly uncomfortable family gatherings with messages like, "Sorry they were such assholes to you today." But she never said anything when it actually mattered or when her voice might have made a difference. I understood her position, though. Speaking up meant painting a target on your back and becoming the next family scapegoat. So it was easier to keep quiet and stay under the radar. I met my girlfriend Nicole about 3 years ago when she brought her BMW in for service at the garage where I work. She's 28 years old and works as a network security specialist for a tech company. Unlike my parents, she actually appreciates mechanical skill and doesn't mind dating a guy who gets some grease under his fingernails from time to time. She drives a 435i that she maintains meticulously, following the manufacturer's recommended service schedule religiously, instead of waiting until something breaks and becomes an expensive emergency repair. We clicked immediately because she's incredibly smart, doesn't take shit from anyone, and has actually called my parents out on their behavior more than once when she witnessed it firsthand. She saw through their facade within the first 5 minutes of meeting them, which was both refreshing and eye-opening for me. "Your parents are using you," she told me bluntly, after witnessing an especially uncomfortable family dinner where my dad had not so subtly hinted about needing money for a new roof. "You realize that's completely messed up, right?" I did realize it, deep down, but some twisted sense of obligation and family loyalty kept me chained to them. There was also this persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, if I did enough for them, they would eventually see my value and give a damn about me as a person, rather than just as a convenient resource. The first major loan happened when I was 25 years old. I had been working at the garage for 7 years at that point, and had finally managed to save up a decent emergency fund of about $14,000. I was proud of that accomplishment because it represented years of careful budgeting and living below my means. That's when my parents decided to refinance their house to pay for a kitchen renovation that had spiraled completely out of control. Instead of scaling back their plans when costs exceeded their budget, they doubled down and committed to high-end appliances and custom cabinets they absolutely could not afford. The call came while I was in the middle of finishing up a complex engine rebuild on a 911 Turbo. "Tyler, we're in a bit of a pickle," my mother said, her voice carefully calculated to hit that perfect balance between casual and desperate. "The bank is threatening foreclosure, and we need help immediately." Without thinking it through or asking the hard questions I should have asked, I transferred $10,000 to them that very night. The agreement was that they would pay me back in monthly installments starting in 6 months, once they got their financial situation sorted out. I'm sure you can guess exactly how many payments I actually received over the following months and years. The answer is exactly 0 payments, which was shocking to absolutely no one except my naive younger self who still believed that family meant something to these people. What made it even more insulting was that just 1 month after I had bailed them out with my hard-earned savings, my dad showed up at a family dinner sporting a brand new Omega watch that probably cost more than most people make in a month. When I asked him about it, he casually mentioned that it was a gift to himself for managing such a stressful situation with the bank so successfully. The watch easily cost $3,000 or more, which meant he was treating himself to luxury items with what was essentially my money, while completely ignoring his promise to pay me back. The second major financial hit came when Blake managed to total his car by wrapping it around a tree while texting and driving. Miraculously, he walked away from the accident completely uninjured. But the car was destroyed, and he was completely uninsured because he had let his coverage lapse to save money for his various business ventures. Another desperate phone call, another $7,500 drained from my savings account to buy him a replacement vehicle so he could supposedly get to his new job and start turning his life around. Blake got the car and immediately started posting pictures of his new ride on Instagram, positioning himself as some kind of self-made success story. "Grind never stops" was the caption he used, which was particularly galling, considering that his version of grinding consisted entirely of mooching off his older brother while drinking $7 lattes and pretending he was hustling and networking. While I was working 50-hour weeks and actually earning money through legitimate employment, Blake was sleeping until noon every day and spending his afternoons networking at local cafes. This networking consisted primarily of hitting on baristas and trying to recruit unsuspecting people into his various pyramid schemes and get-rich-quick ventures that changed every few months. He once tried to sell me on investing in some cryptocurrency project that he was supposedly consulting for, positioning himself as some kind of blockchain expert despite having no technical background whatsoever. When I asked basic questions about the tokenomics and actual use case for whatever digital currency he was promoting, he told me condescendingly that I was too locked into outdated financial paradigms to understand the revolutionary nature of what he was offering. This was coming from a guy who couldn't balance a checkbook or hold down a minimum wage job for more than a few months. But somehow, he felt qualified to lecture me on advanced financial concepts. The biggest and most devastating financial hit came 3 years ago when my dad got completely scammed on some investment scheme that his golf buddy had recommended to him. It was something involving cryptocurrency mining equipment that turned out to be complete bullshit, run by con artists who took his money and disappeared. My parents were suddenly facing liens on their property and possibly even worse legal consequences if they couldn't come up with the money quickly. This time the ask was for $25,000, which represented the majority of what I had been saving for a house down payment. Nicole and I had been talking seriously about moving in together, and I had been carefully planning to buy a property in a decent neighborhood with good schools and reasonable property taxes. I had spent months doing research, calculating mortgage rates, comparing different areas, and was literally weeks away from making an offer on a place I had fallen in love with. All of that careful planning and dreaming went straight out the window when my dad called with his voice shaking, talking frantically about potential bankruptcy and losing everything they had worked for their entire lives. Despite my better judgment and against Nicole's advice, I transferred the money after finally wising up enough to get a signed agreement stating that they would repay the full amount with interest within 18 months. I drafted the agreement myself, had it properly notarized, and made sure the terms were crystal clear and legally binding. For once in their lives, they actually seemed genuinely grateful for my help and repeatedly assured me that this time would be different. They promised that they had learned their lesson about financial responsibility and would prioritize paying me back above all other expenses. 18 months came and went without a single payment or even an acknowledgement that the deadline had passed. When I finally brought up the missed deadline and asked about their repayment plan, my father acted like I had personally insulted his honor and pissed on his grave. "Family helps family, Tyler," he said in that patronizing tone he had perfected over the years. "We'd do the same for you without question." But the truth was that they wouldn't do the same for me, and we all knew it. They had never once offered to help me with anything financial, and they certainly wouldn't have loaned me $25,000 if I had asked for it. I know most of you are probably thinking, why the hell would you even help them in the first place? The answer is complicated and probably sounds pathetic. But when you grow up being the invisible kid in your own family, you get stuck thinking that if you just do enough for them, they'll finally give a damn about you as a person. It was a stupid psychological trap that took me way too long to snap out of, but eventually I did. The worst part of this entire situation wasn't even the money itself, though losing tens of thousands of dollars certainly stung. What really got to me was that every single time I visited my parents' house, there was always some new luxury item that they definitely couldn't afford. There was a top-of-the-line Vitamix blender that cost $500, a Peloton bike that my mom used exactly twice before it became an expensive clothes rack, and a massive Weber grill for my dad's BBQ hobby that he completely abandoned after about 2 months of use. All of this conspicuous consumption was happening while I was getting regular texts from them, asking if I could chip in for property taxes or unexpected medical bills that they claimed were putting them in financial distress. What made it even more infuriating was that I later discovered through Maya's social media posts that they had been taking vacations they never bothered to mention to me. There were weekend getaways to expensive resorts, a cruise to Alaska that lasted 2 weeks, and even a trip to Italy that I only found out about through Maya's Facebook photos. All of this luxury travel was happening while they were claiming they couldn't even make token payments on the massive amounts of money they owed me. They were literally spending more on a single vacation than they would have needed to start making meaningful progress on their debt to me. My best friend Derek, who I've been close with since we took auto shop together in high school, could see the situation clearly from an outside perspective. He had watched this toxic pattern play out for years and had zero tolerance for the bullshit my family was putting me through. Derek owns his own body shop now and has built a successful business through hard work and treating people with respect. "Dude, they're treating you like their personal backup plan," he told me bluntly one night when we were having wings at our usual sports bar. "They know you'll always cave and bail them out, so they don't even try to handle their own problems anymore. Why would they? They've got you trained to come running every time they snap their fingers." Nicole was even more direct in her assessment of the situation. "Your parents are emotional vampires," she said during one of our many conversations about my family drama. "They'll drain you completely dry if you let them continue this pattern." I knew deep down that both Derek and Nicole were absolutely right, but breaking away from decades of conditioning seemed almost impossible at the time. The irony of the entire situation wasn't lost on me. Here were my parents, who had spent my entire childhood preaching about financial responsibility and the importance of living within your means, while simultaneously demonstrating absolutely none of those qualities in their own lives. They were the type of people who would lecture me about saving money and being responsible while secretly living paycheck to paycheck and relying on their children to bail them out of every financial crisis they created for themselves. The first serious crack in my resolve to maintain this dysfunctional family dynamic came during Thanksgiving last year. I had spent 3 hours making a bourbon pecan pie completely from scratch because my mom had specifically mentioned wanting one during a phone conversation the week before. I took pride in my baking skills and wanted to contribute something special to the family dinner. When I arrived at their house carrying the carefully prepared dessert, she barely even acknowledged it. "Oh, you brought dessert," she said dismissively, without even looking at what I had made. "We already have plenty of dessert, but I'm sure someone will eat it eventually." The plenty she was referring to turned out to be a collection of store-bought pumpkin pies that sat alongside my homemade creation, like cheap imitations next to the real thing. Throughout the entire dinner, my parents fawned over Blake's latest supposed business breakthrough, which was some dropshipping scheme where he was selling knockoff fitness equipment to unsuspecting customers online. They hung on his every word as he described his revolutionary business model and projected profits that would never materialize. When I tried to mention the classic Porsche I was restoring as a side project, something I was genuinely passionate about and proud of, my dad immediately cut me off mid-sentence. "Speaking of cars, Blake needs new tires for winter driving," he said, completely ignoring what I had been saying. "Tyler, you can get those at cost through your shop, right?" I found myself nodding mechanically while feeling Nicole squeeze my knee under the table in a gesture of support and solidarity. The message from my family was crystal clear. My achievements and interests weren't worth discussing or celebrating, but my utility as a source of free labor and discounted goods was always relevant and expected. After dinner was over, Blake cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping clean up. "Mom mentioned that you've been difficult about the money thing lately," he said, with that entitled smirk I had grown to hate. "Don't be such a jerk about it, man. It's just money. Just money. My money. About $42,500 of it over the years, to be exact. But hey, who was counting besides me?" That weekend, something fundamental shifted in my mindset. I started compiling detailed documentation of every financial transaction I had made with my parents over the years. I gathered bank transfer records, text messages, emails, and anything else that provided concrete evidence of these so-called loans that had never been repaid. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with all this documentation yet, but something inside me had changed permanently. I was finally done being their doormat. I also started saying no to their smaller requests for the first time in my adult life. When my mom called asking me to come over and set up their new smart TV because they couldn't figure out the complicated remote, I told her I was busy and suggested she call the store where they bought it for technical support. When my dad asked me to help him move some heavy furniture around the house, I recommended a professional moving service instead of dropping everything to accommodate his schedule. Each refusal was met with guilt trips and passive-aggressive comments about how I was changing and becoming selfish. But I held firm in my new boundaries. The dynamic between us shifted almost immediately once I stopped being available for every little request and demand. Suddenly, I was getting phone calls from relatives I barely spoke to throughout the year, all of them asking why I was supposedly abandoning my parents in their time of need. Blake started posting vague but pointed social media comments about ungrateful siblings who forget where they came from and turn their backs on family. Maya warned me that I had become the main topic of conversation at every family dinner I didn't attend, with my parents painting me as the villain who was selfishly withholding support from them. Good. Let them talk all they wanted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dancing to their tune or desperately trying to earn their approval. It felt like finally taking a full breath after years of suffocating under their expectations and manipulations. I was discovering what it felt like to live for myself instead of constantly trying to please people who would never be satisfied no matter what I did for them. The final straw that broke my willingness to maintain any relationship with them wasn't even directly about money. It was about something much more fundamental. My place in the family, and whether I had any value to them beyond being a convenient resource to exploit. My mom's retirement party was scheduled for June, and the event was being held at the country club where my parents couldn't afford a membership, but had somehow managed to finagle the venue through one of my mother's former patients who worked as a professional event planner. They went all out for this retirement celebration. There were custom invitations, a professional photographer to document the event, elaborate floral arrangements, and a string quartet to provide background music. Nothing but the best for what my mother considered to be the crowning achievement of her nursing career. The entire production probably cost more than most people's wedding receptions. I received my invitation about 3 weeks before the event and RSVP'd yes, despite my growing misgivings about the whole situation. I even took the time to find her a thoughtful and expensive gift. I tracked down a vintage nursing textbook from the 1950s through a collector who specialized in medical memorabilia. It cost me nearly $800 and took months of searching to locate, but it was the exact edition she had mentioned wanting years ago for her office display. I thought it would be meaningful and show that I had been paying attention to her interests. Nicole offered to come with me as moral support, but she had a work conference she couldn't miss that same weekend. "Call me the second you want to leave," she insisted before I left for the party. "I don't care what time it is or what's happening. If you need an excuse to get out of there, just call me and I'll give you one." I arrived at the country club exactly on time, parked my reasonably clean Honda Civic among all the Audis and BMWs in the parking lot, and headed inside with the carefully wrapped gift. The ballroom was decked out with elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people make in a week. A string quartet was playing classical music in the corner, while servers in formal uniforms circulated with drinks and appetizers. The entire event was funded by my parents, who supposedly couldn't afford their mortgage payments without my financial assistance, which made perfect sense in their twisted logic. I spotted my mother holding court near the center of the room, wearing what was clearly a brand new designer dress that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. My dad stood beside her with his chest puffed out like a peacock, basking in the attention and acting like he was the guest of honor instead of just the spouse. Blake was nearby, already 3 drinks deep despite the party having just started, loudly telling some story to a group of my mother's former nursing colleagues who looked like they were trapped in the conversation. Maya saw me first and hurried over to greet me. "Tyler, you made it," she said, giving me a quick hug, though her expression was tense and worried. "Mom was just asking if you were actually going to show up tonight." I held up the carefully wrapped vintage textbook and asked where I should put her gift. "There's a table by the entrance for presents," she said, then lowered her voice to a whisper. "Listen, there's been some kind of issue with the seating chart that I think you should know about." Before she could finish explaining what she meant, my mom spotted me from across the room and waved imperiously for me to come over. I made my way through clusters of people I didn't recognize, navigating past hospital administrators, doctors, and various country club types who all had that distinct look of old money and social status. "Tyler, you're here," Mom said, giving me one of those fake air kisses near my cheek. Her perfume was so strong, it was practically suffocating. "Don't you look adequate?" she said with a deliberate pause, like she had been practicing that particular insult. I handed her the carefully wrapped package containing the vintage nursing textbook I had spent months tracking down. "Happy retirement, Mom." She took it with a perfunctory smile and immediately passed it to a nearby server without even looking at what it was or acknowledging the thought that had gone into it. "Put that with the others, please," she said dismissively. Then, turning back to me, "The Harrisons just arrived and I really should go greet them properly." My dad gave me that familiar clap on the shoulder that I had grown to hate over the years. The quick double tap that always felt dismissive and patronizing rather than affectionate. "Good to see you, son," he said, before immediately walking away to chase after someone who clearly had more social value than his own child. Blake sauntered over with a drink in his hand, his words already slurred despite the early hour. Well, look who it is. The grease monkey actually cleaned up for once," he said with a mocking grin. "I didn't think you'd be able to pry yourself away from your precious engines long enough to attend a family event. Or could you actually afford to take a night off from work?" "Not now, Blake," I warned him, already feeling my patience wearing thin. He held up his hands in mock surrender, swaying slightly. "Just saying hi to my big brother. Don't be so touchy about everything," he said, before wandering back to his audience, probably to tell them about how he was going to be a millionaire soon from selling counterfeit protein powder or whatever his latest scheme was. I grabbed a water from a passing server and took stock of the room. There were at least 150 people in attendance, many of whom I had never seen before in my life. The cost of this elaborate party could have easily paid back at least half of what my parents owed me, but apparently their social status was more important than their financial obligations to their own son. I spotted several hospital administrators mingling near the bar, along with a couple of doctors I recognized from previous family events, and various country club types who all had that distinct look of old money and inherited privilege. When people began moving toward the elegantly set tables for dinner, I started looking for my name card to find where I was supposed to sit. I moved from table to table, scanning the place cards carefully. All the important guests were seated near the front of the room, close to the head table where my parents would be holding court. My mom's boss was at table 2, along with several hospital board members and colleagues she actually liked and respected. Blake was seated at the head table right next to my parents, and so was Maya, though she looked distinctly uncomfortable about the whole arrangement. My name wasn't at any of these prominent tables, which was disappointing but not entirely surprising given my family's track record. I kept searching, moving toward the back of the room and checking every single place card. Did they actually forget to set a place for me at my own mother's retirement party? That seemed like a new low, even for them. That's when I noticed the event planner consulting her clipboard near the ballroom doors, looking slightly frazzled as she coordinated the dinner service. I approached her, keeping my voice casual and friendly. "Excuse me, I can't seem to find my seat anywhere. Could you help me locate it?" She checked her comprehensive list, frowning slightly as she scanned the names. "Oh, you're her son," she said when I nodded in confirmation. "Yes, there's been a slight overflow issue with the seating arrangements. You'll be seated in the atrium just outside the main ballroom once dinner begins." "The atrium?" I repeated, not quite believing what I was hearing. "You mean outside the ballroom entirely?" "Yes, we have a small table set up out there for you," she explained cheerfully, as if this was a perfectly normal arrangement. "It's quite nice, actually, right by the decorative fountain where it's peaceful and quiet." I thanked her politely and walked toward the atrium to see this setup for myself. It was a small transitional space between the main ballroom and the lobby area. A single cocktail table had been set up with one solitary chair. There was no place setting, no centerpiece, no decorative elements, just a bare table and chair positioned like I was supposed to be the coat check attendant or security guard rather than a member of the family. I stood there staring at that lonely chair when I heard my mother's voice behind me. "Oh, good, Tyler. You found your spot," she said, as if this arrangement was perfectly reasonable and normal. I turned to face her, trying to keep my voice calm and measured. "A cocktail table in the hallway by myself?" She gave me that familiar, condescending sigh that had made me feel small and insignificant my entire life. "We had very limited seating in the main room," she explained with fake patience. "We had to prioritize the most important guests, and I'm sure you understand how these things work." "Limited seating?" I gestured toward the open ballroom doors where I could clearly see at least a dozen empty chairs scattered throughout the room. "There's obviously plenty of room in there. Those seats are reserved for people who RSVP'd properly and confirmed their attendance in advance," she said, a slight edge entering her voice as if I was being unreasonably difficult about this obvious slight. "I RSVP'd 3 weeks ago," I countered, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. "Well, there must have been some kind of mix-up with the guest list," she said, waving her hand dismissively as if my presence was an inconvenience she hadn't planned for. "It's just dinner, Tyler. Don't make a scene about something so trivial. So you're telling me that at your retirement party, there's absolutely no space for me, your own son?" I asked, the absurdity of the situation finally hitting me full force. She glanced nervously over her shoulder toward the ballroom where her important guests were waiting. "People are expecting dinner to start soon, Tyler," she said impatiently. "Just sit here for the meal, and you can join us for the dancing and socializing afterward when there's more room to move around." At that exact moment, something fundamental broke inside me. It wasn't a dramatic snap or explosive realization, but rather the quiet finality of something that had been deteriorating for years, finally giving way under the weight of accumulated disappointments and betrayals. "No," I said simply, the word carrying more conviction than I had felt in years. Her eyes widened in genuine surprise, as if the concept of me refusing her demands was completely foreign. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" I said no. "I'm not sitting in the hallway like some embarrassing secret while you pretend to be something you're not to impress people you're desperate to have accept you," I replied, my voice steady and clear. Her face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You're making a scene and embarrassing me in front of my colleagues," she hissed under her breath. "No, you made a statement tonight," I shot back. Putting me out here in the hallway was a deliberate statement about where I rank in your life. Below Blake, below your work friends, below maintaining appearances for people who don't actually care about you. I've been your backup plan and financial safety net for years, and I can't even get a seat at your table when it matters. That's not true, and you know it, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. It is absolutely true, and you know it, I said firmly. And you know what? I'm done. I've been done for a while now, but I just didn't want to admit it to myself until tonight. I walked past her and headed back into the ballroom, moving with purpose toward the gift table near the entrance. I located the package I had brought and picked it up. If she couldn't be bothered to acknowledge the thought and effort I had put into finding her the perfect gift, then I couldn't be bothered to leave it for her to ignore. My dad intercepted me as I was heading toward the exit, his face reddening with anger and indignation. Where do you think you're going? Your mother is upset, and you're causing a scene that's ruining her special night. Good, I replied without hesitation. She should be upset about how she's treated me tonight, and for years before this. I kept walking toward the exit, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments from the other guests who were starting to notice the family drama unfolding. As I reached the ballroom doors, I heard Blake's loud, drunken voice carrying across the room. Classic Tyler, always has to make everything about himself and ruin other people's special moments. I didn't turn around or dignify his comment with a response. I just kept walking, carrying the vintage textbook under my arm as I headed for the parking lot. In my car, I immediately called Nicole to tell her what had just happened. They put me at a goddamn cocktail table in the hallway, I said, when she answered, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Not even in the same room as everyone else. A cocktail table by myself, like I was some kind of afterthought or embarrassment they needed to hide. Those fucking assholes, she said, and I could hear the genuine anger in her voice. I knew something like this would happen. I had a bad feeling about you going to that party alone, but I hoped I was wrong about how they'd treat you. Are you okay? She asked, her tone shifting to concern for my emotional state. Yeah, I think I am, I said, surprising myself with how calm I felt. I think I finally get it now. This dynamic between us is never going to change no matter what I do or how much I sacrifice for them. So what are you going to do about it? She asked, and I could hear the support and encouragement in her voice. I started the car and pulled out of the country club parking lot. Something I should have done a long time ago, I replied, with more determination than I had felt in years. At home, I pulled out the thick folder I had been compiling for nearly a year, ever since that conversation with Derek at the sports bar. It contained bank statements showing all the transfers I had made to my parents' accounts over the years, emails confirming the nature of these transactions as loans rather than gifts, and most importantly, the signed and notarized agreement for that final $25,000 loan with its detailed repayment schedule that had been completely ignored. Nicole had been telling me for months to prepare for this day, encouraging me to document everything and get my financial records in order. I just hadn't been emotionally ready to face the reality of cutting them off completely until tonight's humiliation forced my hand. I called Derek and told him exactly what had happened at the retirement party. Jesus Christ, he muttered when I finished describing the cocktail table in the hallway. That's low even for them, and I've seen them pull some pretty shitty moves over the years. I'm doing it, I told him firmly. That thing we talked about months ago. I'm going nuclear on them. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line as Derek processed what I was saying. You sure about this? Once you start down this path, it's going to get really ugly, and there's no going back to the way things were. It's already ugly, I replied without hesitation. It's been ugly for years. I'm just finally ready to stop pretending otherwise and do something about it. I spent the next day going through every single email, text message, and bank statement I could find, creating a detailed timeline of financial transactions, promises made and broken, and payment schedules that had been completely ignored. I had screenshots of Blake's Instagram posts showing him making extravagant purchases and living a lifestyle funded by money he had never earned, all while my parents claimed they couldn't afford to repay me. I also had recordings of phone calls where they explicitly referred to the money as loans that they would definitely pay back once they got their finances sorted out. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer that Derek had recommended to me months earlier when I first started considering legal action. Ellen specialized in civil litigation and had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive when representing her clients. She had short, cropped gray hair, wore business suits that meant she was serious about her work, and didn't waste time on pleasantries or small talk. She reviewed my extensive documentation without any judgment, spreading the papers across her conference table and examining each piece of evidence methodically. "You have a very strong case here," she said, adjusting her glasses as she looked up from the paperwork. "Especially for the most recent loan with the signed and notarized agreement. The earlier transactions are less clear-cut from a legal standpoint, but they're still recoverable given the evidence and the pattern of behavior you've documented." "I want it all back," I said firmly, leaving no room for negotiation. "Every single penny they've taken from me over the years. We'll start with a formal demand letter," she explained, outlining her strategy. "If they refuse to comply with our demands, we'll file a lawsuit and potentially seek an attachment on their property to secure the debt." But I had something else in mind, something more comprehensive than just getting my money back. It wasn't enough to simply recover what they owed me. I wanted to make absolutely sure they could never exploit me or anyone else again. "Before we send anything, I need to know something," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "If they've been using my money to support their lifestyle while refusing to repay me, does that constitute fraud?" Ellen raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the direction of my thinking. "Potentially, yes. If they took the money under false pretenses with no genuine intention of repaying it, that could indeed constitute fraud." "Why do you ask?" I had discovered something troubling while organizing my documentation the night before. In the email exchanges about that final investment disaster where my father had lost so much money, he had mentioned other investors, friends and family members who had also put money into his various schemes. I had followed that thread and found evidence that my parents had essentially been running an informal Ponzi scheme, borrowing from one person to pay back another, always with promises of returns that never materialized. Ellen's interest was clearly piqued by this revelation. "That would change our approach significantly," she said, her tone becoming more serious. "Do you have concrete evidence of this pattern of behavior?" "Some," I admitted. "Not enough yet, but I know where to look for more, and I think I can get access to additional documentation." Ellen laid out a comprehensive strategic approach that would require us to document everything meticulously, identify other potential victims of their schemes, and build a case that went far beyond my personal situation. She warned me that this would be a lengthy and complex process, but I didn't care about the time investment. I was committed to seeing this through to the end, no matter how long it took or how ugly things got along the way. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked closely with Ellen and a financial investigator she recommended, who specialized in tracking money flows and identifying patterns of financial misconduct. We methodically traced the movement of funds, identified potential victims of my parents' schemes, and built a comprehensive picture of their financial misconduct that went far beyond what they had done to me personally. The investigator was able to find concrete evidence of at least 7 other people who had invested money with my father over the past 5 years, none of whom had received their promised returns or even regular updates on their supposed investments. The amounts ranged from a few $1,000s to over $30,000, and the total sum was staggering. The demand letter was drafted but not yet sent because we needed one crucial piece of the puzzle to make our case ironclad. That missing piece fell into place when Maya called me, expressing concern about my sudden disappearance from all family events and wondering if everything was okay between us. I took a calculated risk and confided in her about my investigation and what I had discovered about our parents' financial schemes. Her response completely shocked me and validated everything I had suspected. "I knew something was off about Dad's investment opportunities," she said. "He actually asked me for $15,000 last year for some guaranteed investment opportunity that was supposed to double my money within 6 months. I didn't have that kind of cash available, so I never found out what happened with it, but now I'm really glad I couldn't afford to get involved. Would you be willing to help me gather more evidence?" I asked carefully, knowing that I was putting her in a difficult position between her loyalty to our parents and doing what was right. After some hesitation and a lot of soul-searching, she agreed to help. Maya had regular access to our parents' home when they were away for their various social engagements, and she was able to photograph financial documents that they had carelessly left scattered around their home office. What we found in those documents was absolutely damning and provided the smoking gun we needed. There was a handwritten list of investors with detailed payment schedules that had never been fulfilled, evidence of systematic misrepresentation of their financial ventures to potential investors, and most disturbing of all, a notebook where my father had meticulously tracked which family members and friends were easy targets for loans and investments. Next to my name, he had written "reliable source and minimal questioning," which felt like a knife in the gut when I saw it in his own handwriting. Ellen reviewed this new evidence with growing confidence and excitement. "This changes everything," she said, spreading the photographs across her desk. "We're not just looking at civil recovery anymore. There's genuine potential for criminal charges here, depending on how aggressively the prosecutor wants to pursue this case." The demand letter was completely revised and expanded to reflect the scope of what we had discovered. The total amount we were demanding was $42,500 plus accrued interest, with terms requiring full repayment within 30 days, or we would proceed with legal action that could potentially include criminal complaints for fraud and operating an unlicensed investment scheme. I also set up meetings with two of the other investors we had identified through our investigation. One was my dad's former colleague, now retired, who had put in $30,000 for what he thought was a legitimate real estate investment opportunity that was guaranteed to provide steady returns. The other was a distant cousin who had contributed $15,000 to what my father had described as a guaranteed growth fund that would outperform any traditional investment options. Both of these people were angry when they learned the truth about what had happened to their money, but neither had taken any action because they assumed they were the only ones who had been duped by my father's schemes. They had been suffering in silence, too embarrassed to admit they had been taken advantage of by someone they trusted. By the time we finished our investigation, we had documented evidence of over $150,000 in fraudulent investments across 9 different individuals spanning 6 years. Ellen advised forming a coalition of victims to strengthen our case significantly. "There's real power in numbers," she explained, "and it demonstrates a clear pattern of predatory behavior rather than just an isolated incident or misunderstanding." The letter was sent by certified mail on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, my phone was absolutely blowing up with calls and text messages from my family. My mom's message said, "How could you do this to your own family after everything we've sacrificed for you over the years?" My dad's text was much more direct and hostile. "You ungrateful little shit. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us." Blake's message was predictably threatening. "You're dead to us, you backstabbing piece of trash." This isn't over. I didn't respond to any of their messages, following Ellen's advice to avoid any direct communication once legal proceedings had officially begun. Any contact between us needed to go through our respective attorneys to avoid compromising the case. Maya called me that evening with an update on the family chaos. "They're absolutely freaking out," she said. "Dad's talking about fighting this in court and proving that the money was all gifts, not loans. Blake is drunk and threatening to teach you a lesson, whatever that's supposed to mean. Mom is crying and calling everyone she knows to complain about how ungrateful and vindictive you're being. They don't have a leg to stand on legally, and they know it," I told her confidently. "This is just the beginning of what they're going to face." 2 days later, Blake showed up at my apartment building, and I could smell the alcohol on him from 10 feet away. "You need to drop this whole thing right now," he slurred, pushing past me into my living room without being invited. He looked like he'd been on a serious drinking bender since the demand letter had arrived, with bloodshot eyes and several days' worth of stubble. "You need to leave immediately," I replied, keeping my distance and staying near the door. "This situation isn't up for discussion or negotiation. You think you can just mess with Mom and Dad like this?" he said, swaying slightly as he tried to focus on me. "We'll destroy you completely. You're nothing but a traitor who fixes rich people's cars for a living." "Mom and Dad, or just your meal ticket?" I asked calmly, which seemed to enrage him even more. He charged at me then, swinging wildly and clumsily. I stepped aside easily, and he stumbled past me, crashing into my coffee table and sending magazines and remotes flying. Before he could recover his balance, I had my phone out and was dialing. "Leave right now, or I'm calling the police and adding assault charges to the growing list of family accomplishments," I warned him. "This isn't over," he spat, struggling to get back to his feet. "You think you're so much better than the rest of us, but you're nothing. You've always been nothing, and you always will be." He left, slamming my apartment door so hard that I was surprised it didn't come off its hinges. I immediately called Ellen to report the incident and filed for a restraining order against him. The security camera in my apartment hallway had captured the entire confrontation, which would serve as evidence if we needed it. My parents' official response came through their attorney the following week, and it was exactly what Ellen had predicted. They claimed that all the money I had given them over the years had been gifts, not loans, and they tried to countersue me for defamation and harassment. They cited family obligation and emotional distress, trying to paint me as an ungrateful son who was attacking his loving parents for no reason. It was a real classy move from the people who had supposedly taught me about responsibility and integrity. Ellen was completely unimpressed with their legal strategy. Their position is extremely weak, she said, after reviewing their response. We have extensive documentation, multiple witnesses, and a clear pattern of deceptive behavior. The restraining order against your brother actually strengthens our case by demonstrating the hostile and potentially dangerous environment you've been dealing with. But I wasn't satisfied with just achieving a legal victory and getting my money back. I wanted them to understand exactly what they had done, not just to me, but to everyone else they had manipulated and exploited over the years. I wanted there to be real consequences for their actions that went beyond just financial repayment. I compiled a comprehensive document detailing their financial misconduct, including statements from the other victims we had identified through our investigation. I sent copies of this document to every family member, close friend, and business associate in their social circle. I also sent copies to the hospital board where my mother had worked, and to the country club they had been desperately trying to join for years. The reaction was swift and absolutely devastating to their carefully constructed social image. Friends they had borrowed money from and never repaid suddenly started asking hard questions about what had happened to their investments. The hospital initiated a formal ethics review of my mother's financial conduct and her interactions with patients and colleagues. The country club quietly removed their membership application from consideration and made it clear they were no longer welcome. Their social standing, which was the thing they valued above absolutely everything else, crumbled almost overnight. People who had looked up to them and respected them for years now crossed the street to avoid having to make eye contact with them at the grocery store. I received a threatening letter from their lawyer claiming that I was engaged in a campaign of harassment and defamation. That's completely expected, Ellen told me when I showed her the letter. They're lashing out because they know they're in serious trouble. It actually means we have them on the run and they're getting desperate. We proceeded to court, confident in our case and the strength of our evidence. My parents clearly didn't expect me to follow through with the lawsuit. They thought I would cave under family pressure and social expectations like I always had in the past. They were completely wrong about my resolve this time. The legal process dragged on for nearly 6 months, with delays and legal maneuvering from both sides. But the evidence we had compiled was absolutely overwhelming. The situation became even more damning when other victims came forward to testify about their experiences with my parents' investment schemes. The details that emerged during the discovery phase of the lawsuit were even worse than we had initially found. My father had been maintaining 2 completely different sets of financial books for years, and there were email exchanges where my parents explicitly discussed using my money to fund Blake's various business ventures while knowing full well they had no intention of ever repaying me. The judge reviewed everything methodically and ruled decisively in my favor. "These were clearly loans, not gifts," she declared from the bench, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "The documentation is extensive and unambiguous." The court ordered full repayment of $42,500 plus statutory interest, and my parents looked absolutely shell-shocked as the reality of their situation hit them. Their lawyer immediately leaned over, whispering urgently in their ears. I knew exactly what he was telling them. They didn't have that kind of liquid cash available, and their options for coming up with the money were extremely limited given their damaged credit and reputation. "Your Honor," their lawyer said, standing up with obvious reluctance, "my clients respectfully request the opportunity to submit a reasonable payment plan, as they don't currently have the full amount available in liquid assets." The judge was not sympathetic to their financial constraints. She delivered her final ruling with sharp precision, ordering my parents to repay the full amount based on the overwhelming documented evidence and the pattern of harassment demonstrated by the restraining order against Blake. She gave them exactly 14 days to submit a detailed and realistic payment plan, making it crystal clear that failure to comply would result in forced liquidation of their assets to satisfy the judgment. Their attorney immediately began whispering to them again, likely explaining the full severity of their legal and financial situation. They left the courthouse that day without making eye contact with me, their heads down and their confident facade completely shattered. My revenge wasn't complete yet, but victory was definitely within reach, and I could taste the satisfaction of finally holding them accountable for years of exploitation and manipulation. 2 weeks later, Maya called to tell me that our parents had been forced to put their house on the market. They had no choice, she explained. They can't qualify for another loan anywhere. Everyone in town knows what they did now, and no bank or credit union will touch them. I felt absolutely nothing when I heard this news. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just the cold certainty that justice was finally being served after years of watching them escape consequences for their actions. The flying monkeys descended next, as they always do in these family drama situations. Relatives I rarely spoke to throughout the year suddenly started sending me concerned messages about how I was supposedly destroying the family and tearing apart relationships that had taken decades to build. My mother's colleagues left voicemails about the importance of forgiveness and maintaining mental health during difficult times. Some family friends even had the audacity to show up at the garage where I work, trying to talk sense into me about reconciling with my parents. One of them actually asked if I could take a look at their car's transmission while they were there delivering their lecture about family values. The sheer audacity and lack of self-awareness never stops amazing me. I didn't engage with any of these well-meaning but misguided people. I had made my decision and was committed to seeing it through to the end. The restraining order against Blake was extended after he sent a series of increasingly threatening text messages to me and Nicole. My parents tried to play the health card at this point, with my dad suddenly developing stress-induced hypertension that required immediate medical attention. I didn't respond to that manipulation tactic either. It was funny how his health hadn't been a concern when he was spending my money on luxury watches and expensive vacations. The social fallout from their exposed financial misconduct was just as significant as the legal and financial consequences they were facing. Word spread quickly throughout their entire social circle about what they had done to me and the other victims we had identified. People who had looked up to them for years and considered them pillars of the community now avoided making eye contact with them at the grocery store or local restaurants. My mom's nursing friends, who she had ruled over like a queen bee for decades, suddenly stopped including her in their group text messages and weekly social gatherings. My dad's regular weekly golf game with his longtime buddies evaporated overnight when the other players learned about his investment schemes and fraudulent behavior. What really got to them wasn't even the money they were being forced to repay. It was the complete loss of social status and respect they had spent years building. These were people who had constructed their entire identities around being respected community figures and successful professionals. Now they were widely known as frauds who had exploited their own son and multiple other victims over a period of years. 2 months later, their house sold for significantly less than market value because they desperately needed a quick sale to satisfy the court judgment. They were forced to move into a small, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a much less desirable part of town. And according to Maya, they were struggling to adjust to their dramatically reduced circumstances and lifestyle. Blake had been forced to get an actual full-time job at a warehouse facility and move into a shared apartment with roommates now that the bank of mom and dad was permanently closed for business. The spoiled golden child, who had never held a real job for more than 8 months, was suddenly facing the reality of having to work for a living like everyone else. What an absolute tragedy that was. I used the money I recovered from the lawsuit as a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood with good schools and reasonable property taxes. Nicole moved in with me, and we spent our weekends fixing up the house together, painting rooms, refinishing floors, and making it truly ours. The house needed some work, but it had excellent potential and solid bones. More importantly, it was built on honest money and actual effort, rather than manipulation and exploitation. Life was genuinely good for the first time in years. Without the constant financial and emotional drain of my parents' demands and manipulation, I was able to focus entirely on building my own future with someone who actually cared about me. I got certified in high-performance European engine maintenance and repair, which bumped my annual salary by another $15,000. Nicole got promoted to lead developer at her technology company, with a significant raise and additional responsibilities that she was excited about. We adopted a German Shepherd mix from the local animal shelter and named him Wrench, which seemed appropriate given my profession. On weekends when I wasn't working on the house, I made steady progress on my personal Porsche restoration project, a 1978 911 SC that I had picked up for a reasonable price because the engine was completely shot and needed a complete rebuild. 4 months after the court ruling, Maya called with an update that almost made me laugh out loud. Blake had somehow convinced my parents to invest their remaining savings into his latest get-rich-quick scheme, some NFT project that was supposedly guaranteed to multiply their money by 10 times within just a few weeks. The entire investment vanished when the revolutionary blockchain platform turned out to be complete vaporware, run by some guy operating out of a Caribbean tax haven. absolutely shocking that Blake's business judgment proved to be unreliable. My parents were now truly broke in every sense of the word. The small apartment they had downgraded to suddenly became unaffordable when they lost their remaining savings to Blake's latest scam. My dad's company car had been reclaimed by his former employer when they realized he had been skimming money from client accounts for years to fund his lifestyle and investment schemes. Their credit rating was completely destroyed. Their reputation in the community was in shambles, and their social circle had abandoned them entirely. Blake moved back in with them, turning their cramped two-bedroom apartment into an even more uncomfortable living situation. According to Maya, he blamed everyone but himself for their collective downfall and financial ruin. He had already been written up twice at his warehouse job for showing up late and arguing with supervisors who didn't appreciate his creative approach to following basic workplace rules. My mother tried calling me from different phone numbers after I had blocked all of their regular contacts. "Tyler, we made mistakes, but we're still family," she said in one particularly desperate voicemail. "We're facing eviction and possible homelessness. We just need a little help to get back on our feet and start over." I deleted the message without calling back or acknowledging it in any way. My dad tried a different approach, cornering Derek at a gas station and begging him to reason with me about the situation. Derek told him exactly where to go and how to get there, using language that wasn't suitable for public consumption. Apparently, my dad hadn't expected Derek to tell him to get lost in broad daylight at a crowded Exxon station with other customers watching the confrontation. Maya maintained minimal contact with our parents, but refused to offer any financial assistance, having finally seen through their manipulation tactics and patterns of behavior. She had learned from watching my experience that enabling them would only perpetuate the cycle of exploitation and financial irresponsibility. The true depths of my parents' financial deception and misconduct continued to emerge as time went on. Two of their former friends who had invested money with them filed their own separate lawsuits seeking recovery of their losses. The hospital where my mother had worked conducted a comprehensive audit of her department and found evidence that she had been manipulating staffing schedules to collect overtime pay for hours she hadn't actually worked. My dad's former employer discovered that he had been systematically charging personal expenses to company accounts for years, including meals, travel, and even some of the home improvements they had made. It was like turning over a large rock and watching all the insects scatter in different directions once sunlight hit them. Once the first stone was cast and people started looking more closely at their behavior, they didn't like what they found underneath the surface. 8 months after the court judgment, their situation had deteriorated even further. They were evicted from their apartment for non-payment of rent, and Blake had been fired from his warehouse job for stealing inventory that he was apparently planning to sell online. He was now facing petty theft charges in addition to everything else. My parents were essentially homeless, couch surfing between increasingly reluctant relatives who were getting tired of supporting people who had proven themselves to be untrustworthy. Throughout all of this chaos and drama, Nicole stood by me without question or hesitation. One evening after we had finished renovating the kitchen in our new house, I found her admiring the beautiful new quartz countertops we had installed together. I pulled the engagement ring box from my pocket and placed it carefully on the kitchen island. "What do you think about making this living arrangement permanent?" I asked with a smile. She said yes before I even had a chance to drop to one knee properly. We started planning a simple but elegant wedding at a mountain resort about 3 hours from town, inviting only close friends and people who actually cared about our happiness and success. Maya was the only family member on my side who received an invitation to the ceremony. The wedding was scheduled for exactly 1 year after the court judgment, which was a complete coincidence, but felt like a satisfying piece of poetic justice. Derek was going to be my best man, and I couldn't think of anyone I'd rather have standing beside me on the most important day of my life. A week before the ceremony, my parents somehow found out about the wedding through a mutual friend who had seen the announcement. The phone calls started immediately. First my mother, then my father, followed by random relatives I barely remembered existed throughout the year. All of them were insisting that family belongs at weddings, regardless of whatever disagreements had happened in the past, and that I was making a terrible mistake by excluding my own parents from such an important milestone. I didn't respond to any of these calls or messages until my father finally sent me a direct text message asking why they weren't invited to their own son's wedding. I replied with exactly 7 words that perfectly captured the irony of the situation. "There's no space for you. Limited seating." They didn't try to contact me again after that response, finally understanding that I was serious about cutting them out of my life permanently. The wedding day went absolutely perfectly in every way I could have imagined. Maya cried happy tears during the vows, Derek gave a speech that had everyone laughing and crying at the same time, and Nicole looked absolutely incredible in her dress. For the first time in my entire life, I was surrounded completely by people who genuinely wanted the best for me, rather than people who were constantly thinking about what they could take from me or how they could benefit from my success. The ceremony was intimate and meaningful, with about 40 guests who were all there because they cared about us as individuals and as a couple. There were no hidden agendas, no family politics, no drama or manipulation, just pure celebration and love. It was everything I had never known I wanted but desperately needed. After the wedding, Nicole and I settled into our new life together with a sense of peace and contentment that I had never experienced before. We finished renovating the house room by room, each project bringing us closer together and creating something beautiful that was entirely ours. Wrench, our German Shepherd mix, adapted perfectly to having both of us around full-time and became the perfect addition to our little family. I continued working on my Porsche restoration project in the garage, and Nicole would often come out to watch me work and learn about the mechanical process. She was genuinely interested in understanding what I was doing and why I was passionate about it, which was a completely new experience for me after years of having my interests dismissed or ignored. The financial recovery from the lawsuit allowed us to build a solid foundation for our future together. We were able to pay off Nicole's student loans early, max out our retirement contributions, and still have money left over for the occasional vacation or weekend getaway. Living within our means and being responsible with money felt natural and sustainable rather than restrictive. About 6 months after the wedding, I received one final contact attempt from my family. It was a letter, sent through regular mail rather than certified delivery, written in my mother's distinctive handwriting. The letter was several pages long and went through various emotional appeals. They missed me. They were sorry for any misunderstandings. They wanted to rebuild our relationship, and they hoped I would consider giving them another chance to be part of my life. The letter mentioned that they were attending counseling to work on their communication skills and financial management. They claimed to have learned from their mistakes and wanted an opportunity to prove they had changed. They asked if I would be willing to meet for coffee or dinner to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. I read the entire letter carefully, then showed it to Nicole and Derek to get their perspectives. Both of them advised me to be extremely cautious about any contact, given the extensive history of manipulation and exploitation. "Leopards don't change their spots," Derek said bluntly. "They're probably just desperate and looking for a new angle to work." I decided not to respond to the letter at all. After everything that had happened, I realized that I didn't owe them forgiveness, reconciliation, or even acknowledgement. I had built a good life without them, and there was no compelling reason to risk that happiness by allowing them back into my world.